A proper reading of the Christian gospel has to create in anyone who takes it seriously a natural empathy for underdogs. That I think if you don't have that natural feeling toward underdogs after reading the Christian gospel, you ought to read it again. My friend Jim Wallace always likes to say that if you cut the words poor out of what Jesus said, you have a lot of holes in your gospel, in your New Testament. And I think what you have in the Middle East are competing feelings of empathy. I think that there are forms of empathy toward Israel and forms of empathy toward the Palestinians. And our challenge as Christians, but I think also as human beings, are to find ways of bringing these two forms of empathy together. A friend of mine from France and I were talking about the Middle East one day, and we're talking about how the issue is viewed in the United States and how the issue is often viewed in Europe. And my friend spoke of maps of the Middle East as rendered in American and European newspapers. And I have no idea if a careful study of newspapers would prove this point true. But I believe that even if the data aren't there as an allegory, this is quite correct. My friend said that if you look at maps that appear in European newspapers, you tend to have a real close-up of Israel and the Palestinian areas. And so what you have is a large Israel looming over the West Bank and Gaza. And in that account, it is the Palestinians who are the underdogs and the Israelis who are not. He said when you look at American newspapers, the maps of the Middle East pull back quite a ways, and you realize how small Israel is, how vulnerable it is, surrounded by Arab countries who had attacked it in the past. And so your natural instinct is to say it's the Israelis who are the underdog in this situation. And I think that the trying to get a handle on how can one feel empathy for those on both sides of this issue, if Christians only struggle within themselves to figure out that question, they might make a contribution, and they might, at the very least, end some of their own wars on this question.
It would seem to me that a lot of the talk amongst Christians in this country who have not yet developed the capacity to talk empathetically or compassionately about both sides do so because they're in the sociocentric realm of consciousness, if you might want to put it that way, where they've not been able to universalize Christian message and apply it equally to all people, Palestinians, Israelis, and wherever the conflicts might be between. So a question for you is, if in fact that's true, how do we help those Christians among us move from sociocentric thinking to more world-centric thinking so they can have love and compassion for all human beings, not just one side versus the other. Second thing is, if you look just at the Jews in Israel and the Palestinians in Israel, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, and I spoke to Sohail about, is that when you have people who've been under conflict for long periods of time with the research of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or other, whether in emotional or physical dangerous situations over long periods of time, it has an effect on the brain, a direct effect on the brain, and it creates a survival mindset, and it makes it that much more difficult for them to transcend the constraints that their survival mindset puts on themselves. So they cannot necessarily think beyond their immediate day-to-day survival. If in fact that's true, and I think the research points to that to be true, it makes it really difficult for folks on the ground, especially I would think in Gaza, because they're under constant strain. And Israelis who border Gaza, who are also under constant strain, to deal with each other in a more compassionate and loving way. If in fact the research is true and post-traumatic stress disorder plays a role, the question for you would be how can we help those people on the ground kind of move beyond the damage that the situation has caused for them and think kind of more compassionately and lovingly about people outside of their group.
Can't forget, since we're sitting right here in Capitol Hill, the political issues that are associated with this as well, where you have members of Congress who either might have constituents who are Jewish Americans, who might have friends, or in many cases are survivors themselves of the Holocaust and have a strong commitment to a safe and secure Israel. In many cases you have people, and this brings us to the Christian community, those that, and EJ touched upon this, Christians who strongly identify not only with Israel as an underdog and a country that we should be associated with as Americans, but particularly a country that we should be associated with as Christians, because there is the long-standing support and promise made to the Jewish people in the Bible for the restoration of Israel, and importantly in Christian theology for some, that Israel must be established and must be viable for the second coming of Jesus Christ. And that is manifest every day. In my everyday life, I deal with a lot of members of Congress, and I've heard both the very political, where members who basically say, look, I have to take the position I do because of my constituents. An example was just when EJ was reading the speech by Vice President Biden. I came back, I was in Europe actually, and came back just days after the speech, and was walking with a friend of mine who happens to be Orthodox Jewish on the House side, and a Florida member of Congress pulled my friend aside, who was visibly Jewish because he was wearing a yarmulke, and said, I just want you to know that I'm really appalled that Netanyahu had to apologize to Vice President Biden. Netanyahu should never have to apologize for building homes for Jews on Israeli land that is always going to be Jewish land. And I've heard other members of Congress who have likewise echoed those sentiments, that Israel is a land promised to the Jewish people in the Bible, and basically the Palestinians either have to move or just deal with that reality.
The assumption that we hear a lot is that this is a conflict between people who hate each other. And if they could just all love each other, there'd be no conflict anymore. Sort of as if the emotion or this, anti-Arabism or anti-Semitism is the cause of the conflict, and rather that these antipathies that we see are often symptomatic of something deeper, which is geopolitical conflict. And I want to contend that the latter is true, not the former, that much of the anger, much of the hatred that you see is an expression of something much deeper. And that relates to the second assumption, that we often have this idea that the conflict is something static, that it's just there, that it's not changing, but it's quite dynamic. And we've heard about Gaza, and I know I cited these figures before, but I think they need to be told time and time again because they're just so startling. If you look at the Gaza Strip right now, Gaza is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on the face of the planet. It was a beacon of intellectualism for many hundreds of years, right until sort of the massive influx of Palestinian refugees and the period surrounding the founding of the State of Israel. That said, Gaza happened to survive. And part of the reason was because of all of the international involvement. You had all of these schools in there educating the kids and feeding people. So up until even 15 years ago, Gaza's literacy rates were comparable with, and sometimes even exceeded, those of Western countries. Past 3 years, according to UN reports, there's a consistent failure rate of 40% in Arabic, in 6th grade, 90% in mathematics. And if you look out just 10 years from now, there's going to be 1 million more children in Gaza. Now, that's not a static situation. That's a very dynamic situation. That's a generational break. That's a humanitarian crisis that will take many, many generations to unwind, and it's happening right before our eyes in real time.